productive in a changing environment.
Well, thank you, Bill, for that introduction. Today I'm going to talk...
Have I told them about you, where you're from?
No, it's fine. I can be mysterious. Today I'm going to talk about the evolutionary concepts and how these theoretical models of adaptation and dispersal are relevant to plant breeding. I'll be explaining a case study because I've changed from a master's student status to a PhD student within the past year, and I also not fully yet began my research and would like to share with you an interesting research topic that could be applied to plant breeding and hope to look further into this. So here's the outline of my presentation. I'll state the objectives of the presentation, the background information that you need to know to go through this topic, go through a case study explaining the models used in the paper and how they are applicable to plant breeding, along with some of the results and applications, cover the future goals of my research based on this paper, and finally pose some questions of interest to you. The objectives of this paper is to explain the concepts of dispersal and adaptation from an evolutionist perspective, how it can be genetically independent but evolutionary dependent. Describe and define two different types of populations, generalist and specialist, and outline the theoretical model of adaptation and dispersal, and how it's relevant to plant breeding, and finally highlight a couple of concepts for future research. We as plant breeders need to understand that evolutionists think of things as dispersing by wind, water, and other means. We cannot think like this because we want to harvest our progeny, test in the next season, so our dispersal method is genotypes being tested in multiple environments. Historically, this is modeled by phenotype equals genotype plus the environment plus the G by E interaction plus the error. The G by E interaction provides evidence of adaptation of individual genotypes, and the dispersal of viable offspring enables the populations to change for new environments. The genetic factors that are responsible for adaptation and dispersal do not need to be in disequilibrium, however, they need to be mutually dependent. As I go through the slides, I will use the terms generalist population, meaning the population is dispersible and adaptable. For example, a variety that covers multiple environments with multiple modes of resistance, compared to a specialist population, which is not dispersible but adaptable to a specific environment. For example, the right variety for the right acre. Here's the title of the paper that I will be explaining through the next few slides. It's titled On the Evolutionary Interplay Between Dispersal and Local Adaptation in Heterogeneous Environments. So now for the introduction of the Asheville case study. The population structure is shaped fundamentally by dispersal and adaptation, and only a few experiments have considered the joint evolution of both. The purpose of this paper is to explore the evolutionary dynamics of adaptation and dispersal in heterogeneous environments. Use this picture for example. Here in this picture we have the wild type on the right and we have the cultivated soybean on the left. The wild type soybeans has evolved to be the cultivated by soybean breeders who have made crosses, which is the breeder's way of dispersing the plants to test the performance to keep improving until they had the cultivated type, which displays good agronomic characteristics. Here we have a picture of the normal distribution. I'm showing this because the model in the paper comes from the normal distribution, and also that the change agent for the models are mutation rates, to just kind of highlight some points. Here we see the model, one part of the model is for the distribution of site types. The populations of individuals are characterized by the probability to disperse V and an ecological type X. The width of this distribution determines the heterogeneity of the environment. The wider this distribution is, the greater the range of site types a dispersing individual could encounter. So this might be kind of scary, so let's take it into some context. So using soybean relative maturity, soybean varieties are classified into maturity groups according to the range and latitudes in which they are adapted and are most productive. So the question is soybean lines adapted to the environment that it is in, or is it not? If not, Does this line have a chance to move to a different environment? In terms of this season, no. But if the reader decides to keep the line and test or disperse this line into a different environment or maturity zone next season, then they can make the decision. Next part of the model is the fecundity of the individuals with ecological character X on the site type Z. This is the plasticity of the organism. The M is the function of the difference between the parent's ecological type and the site at which it breeds. The sigma M determines the width of the bell-shaped curve, for example, the tolerance of individuals to variation in habitat. Let's again think about the relative maturity for soybeans. If a line can produce well over multiple maturity zones, this means that the sigma M is large, and if it only works for one maturity, it is small. So now for some results. The coevolution of dispersal and local adaptation over time in heterogeneous environments. These are the trajectories of dispersal, probability, and ecological character over time. The left and right columns are environmental heterogeneity levels predetermined by the Bredal group of 0.75 on the left and 0.9 on the right. The probability to disperse V as a function of time. The blue curve up here is starting with full dispersal, so V equals 1. While the red curves are for simulations where it's not dispersing and it starts at V equals 0. Oh, sorry. The dashed black line is the threshold for V of dispersing and below which branching of ecological character X will occur for that value of environmental heterogeneity. Here's the middle panel explaining the ecological character X, starting with dispersal V as a function of time. The bottom panel here corresponds to the blue curve in the top panel where V equals 1. We see that the higher environmental heterogeneity here on the right, we start with full dispersing, and when it drops below the threshold, we go from a monomorphic generalist to a specialist population. So here in this bottom panel, explaining the ecological character X starting with no dispersal. So now we're talking about the red line where V equals 0. It corresponds to the red curves where the simulations are V equals 0. For lower heterogeneity, the branching of the ecological character X occurs when the population starts with no dispersal. But these specialist branches are replaced by a monomorphic generalist population when it crosses the threshold. So you can see when it crosses the threshold, we become a monomorphic generalist population versus starting out as a specialist. So again, here's the overall view of the coevolution of dispersal and local adaptation over time in heterogeneous environments. We see that in the lower level of heterogeneous environments, when we start with no dispersal, and once the threshold is crossed, we move to a generalist population. On the contrary, when we start with a dispersing population in a higher heterogeneity environment, we move from a generalist population to a specialist once the dispersal level falls below that threshold. So if a population is unable to disperse, we have a population that would be considered a specialist or the right variety for the right acre in plant breeding terms. Here we have the joint evolution of dispersal, probability, and ecological character as a function of environmental heterogeneity. The top panels depict the selection of which will produce generalists or specialists at fixed values of dispersal and environmental heterogeneity. The bottom panels are the evolution of adaptation to ecological places as a function of environmental heterogeneity. So now for the selection of generalists or specialists. These panels are showing the probability to disperse V as a function of the environmental heterogeneity sigma. The black line is the stability, so it's stable when it's solid, and when it's broken, it is unstable. The crosses depict the value for V, and the white and gray areas are shown for either generalist in the white, and the gray are the specialist. For example, let's look at the far right one. We see that this population is going from generalist to specialist because it's very unstable. These panels show the evolution of adaptation to ecological places as a function of environmental heterogeneity. The vertical slices, each of these, are the probability distribution of ecological character X for that value at the environmental heterogeneity when the branching occurs. As the environmental heterogeneity is increased beyond the threshold, the number of specialist types increase. So the threshold, we have more specialists. To wrap up this joint evolution of dispersal and probability and ecological character as a function of environment heterogeneity, as the environmental heterogeneity is increased beyond the threshold, the populations move from monomorphic generalists to specialists. We are also forced to select for specialists because the generalists become unstable at higher levels of heterogeneity. So, that's probably pretty heavy. So now let's bring it back to plant breeding. Well, if you think about this, we've been talking about G by E interactions and how we can use this for selection purposes, or how we're going to take this application of different populations and apply to plant breeding context. So here I have two pictures that can be used as adaptation of crops to rapidly changing environments. The picture on the left is showing drought-tolerant soybeans, and here's the non-drought tolerant, and here's the drought-tolerant. And then the picture on the right is a drought-tolerant corn hybrid. You're probably wondering why this is relevant, but if you think in terms of the environment constantly changing, we could create a generalist population of each of these crops that would cover the extremes in the environments. Each of them would have to perform well in the dry or wet environments, but in the end of the day, they would each be adapting to the different environments that they were being dispersed in. From this paper, you can see that this is very much an evolutionist approach. However, I believe that we may be able to use these concepts in a plant breeding program to potentially create materials more efficiently. A couple of items stand out currently and are a focus of my upcoming research. One, I want to consider recombination in diploid organisms as a change agent instead of mutation rates, and adjust the generation time to fit the constraints of plant breeding to tens of cycles instead of millions. I would like to thank my major professor, Dr. Beavis, and the other members of my committee for listening to my proposals numerous times, and I look forward to meeting with them. And then, finally, I'd like to leave you with a couple of questions of interest or food for thought. Will we be forced to select generalists because no prediction or evaluation of genotypic performance in unanticipated environments as plant breeders? Or will this have an impact on cultivar development in either academic or commercial organizations? I now open the floor for other questions.
Nicely done, Haley. Questions for Ms. Haley? I have a question for you guys. Is this the first time you've ever thought about plant breeding from an ecological standpoint? Oh, Ray has thought about. Do you have some thoughts then?
Well, it just goes all the way back to Darwin and the different things evolved in different environments. I'm getting to that point. I was going to ask you, can you give us a sort of practical or concrete example where these concepts would apply?
The question was, is there any practical, concrete examples?
Yeah.
Okay. One could be soybean cyst nematode. But there's further work that needs to be worked upon to figure that out.
What do you mean by soybean cyst?
I don't know.
Does it
Well-
represent an environment? Or does it-
Well, I think if you use soybean cyst nematode, you have to look at both sides of it. You have to look at the soybean as the environment, and you also have to look at the nematode as the environment. And you have to see which one's adaptable and if there is one or if they're both adaptable, and go from there. It's not just one or the other, I doubt it. Betsa?
This is like Breeders will have to decide if you want to have a cultivar that is adaptable to many regions, or if you want to have several cultivars that have good performance in specific regions. So we as breeders, we are going to be facing those questions, right? And we always say it depends on the objective of the program, right?
Mm-hmm.
But based on the knowledge that you have already, would you have a recommendation to us, or what do you think it should be an approach to have a plant that is widely adaptable and an okay performance in several locations, or it's better to have one plant for each location that has the better performance?
Okay, so the question is, as a plant breeder, is it better to have generalist as in widely adapted, or specialist, the right variety for the right acre? I do agree with you. Maybe my lack of inexperience. You do have to know the objective of the breeding program. But I think whether you're in a seed company or in academia, you need to think further along the picture. What's going to be the best case scenario? Is it going to be better to create these generalists so that you have it and it might cover more, or do you want to just do a special variety that's for that acre that might be only limited for maybe a year or two, and then you have to start all over? And of course, we are always recycling lines through our program, but at the same time, could you ever, I'm kind of posing back a question, I guess, would you ever want to stack multiple genes or traits to make more of a generalist and shift those things around? And honestly, I think I'd rather go with the generalist. And we need to breed smarter and faster. So we need to kind of have something that kind of, I don't want to say the Band-Aid, but Bill. Sorry, John. It was, you fought.
This is actually for Ray. Ray still here? Yes. So Ray, what are the environments that we're going to be faced with in the future? You climate modelers are telling us things, and
Yeah.
are we listening?
Yeah, that's why I'm asking all these stupid questions.
Yeah.
No.
Analysis. I find this stuff fascinating. Yeah, the environments that we're going to be faced with in the future are, well, number one, different from now. Slow down. But number two, we're going to see not just different environments, but we're going to start seeing environments where things previously could not exist for their capability of existing, like soybeans that can grow up into the middle of Manitoba, and things like that, as the oasis of this water.
But we have
Also,
I'm really sort of asking the question, the year-to-year variability
yes,
that we've experienced in our lifetime
yes,
has been pretty small.
right.
You guys tell us that that is not going to be our future.
The
Year-to-year variability is going to be enormous.
year-to-year variability and the variability within the year
Yeah.
is going to be much larger. I always remember, was it 2012 where we started out the year extremely wet and then it turned into a drought? 13, whatever. Yeah, you pick the climate.
Whoever. Well, poor kids who are out in the field.
Existing more of that sort of thing. Like, for example, in South Dakota, the average rainfall has increased by about 5% or so over the past 50 years. But the number of rainfall events over 4 inches per day has increased by 200%. So we're going to see rainfall coming in concentrated periods, long dry periods. Those sorts of environments that we, so not just quantitative, but sort of qualitative changes.
So from her perspective, which, you want to go back to,
What
so
slide?
he's saying we're going to have heterogeneous environments. So what are the implications of having heterogeneous environments? So
What-
you
Oh.
some of those that showed you that there, somewhere in there is, go forward, that's a good one. So the environmental heterogeneity is along that bottom
Oh, yeah.
axis. Okay.
Yeah, you can see it.
As things, we may not have a choice, I guess is what this is telling me. That if we're going to end up with heterogeneous environments,
Right.
choose generalists versus specialists. It's going to force us into having specialists for each environment.
But also, we're gonna have heterogeneous environments in time.
Yeah, but yes, this is, they're not, they don't really, these theoretical folks, they don't care if you're talking about in time versus in space. They just say it's heterogeneous.
Yeah, okay.
John had his hand up first. Sorry, guys.
From a reading program perspective, how would managing germplasm, let's say that you shift away from having just specific germplasm for specific acres, and you have instead this kind of this source of more generalist germplasm. How will that affect the breeding process? I guess most specifically with time for developing things for certain locations. Yeah, my point is you're going to have heterogeneous environments, and they're going to change from year to year.
Mm-hmm.
So it seems to me that it's going to take more time to develop things that will grow, maybe that fit the whatever disease resistance profiles necessary for this area, or the time to flowering for this area.
Mm-hmm. So your question is it going to take longer to produce generalist to cover all trait packages in certain areas versus a specialist for each one? Right?
Yeah.
Or did I miss it total?
No, it's just how will that, instead of having specific germplasm, how will having instead perhaps this pool?
Well,
from,
you have to think about it in a context. Like when you're doing, to me, when you're coming up with like specialists, you have like 10, 20, 30, how many ever combinations you're always creating. But if you have a generalist, you might have something like the same female and different donors that bring in different trait packages. And so you're already looking through your germplasm and you're finding lines that have multiple modes of resistant or other genes that are stacked. Plus you have this probably maybe elite female that has a bunch of resistance on that side too, and you're combining it. But like if you think about like the soybean context, you might be moving certain lines from one maturity zone to another maturity zone, and then you'll have all these outliers when you can go out and do plant polls, and you can get a maturity like 0 to like a 2.8 because you crossed a 2.8 or a 0 to a 2.8. So you get this distribution. So it depends on how you approach it, I think.
I think what John was.
Did I
let's
miss?
try
We can try it again.
John,
We can try
let
it
me
again.
Ask the question of you, John, see if this nails it. If year-to-year variability is going, and even within year variability is going to be so large, we have to test our varieties in the environments that we think we're going to end up with. And historically, we've said, well, last year's or this year's environment is probably going to be a good indicator of next year's environment. That's why breeders, evaluate and say, well, I believe performance in this environment, if last year was droughty, will work well in next year's environment, because next year I think it'll be droughty. But what Ray is telling us is that goes away. And so I think what you're asking is, well, how in the heck are we going to breed if we can't predict what the market environment is going to be?
And you're starting from a genetic point farther away. You have this more general, more variability.
Yeah, we've got this germplasm that's been adapted to the last 50 years of environments.
So
suddenly we have to adapt to something that we haven't seen before.
Yeah, it seems there's discord between these two concepts.
Does that help?
Yeah.
I don't know that I have an answer.
Yeah, maybe there's not.
Well,
it was just something
doesn't it
else.
go back to the plant needing to be plastic?
Yeah.
And then you get into
plasticity
plasticity, and then there's a whole nother huge issue. Sorry.
How can we efficiently test for plasticity?
Yeah.
So more locations, more environments, more data.
So you're saying it's a more intense investment in a shorter amount of time?
That's what I would think.
someone wanted to talk.
That's a discussion.
It's
This just brings like a comment that was made by the speaker that we had during the food prize.
World Food Prize.
Yeah, thank you. She was from Wageningen, and I cannot remember, but I think it's one of the heads of the University of Wageningen. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, by the way.
Close,
But,
very close.
but she was saying something like, do you think that in the future the agriculture will be in a field or it will be in a greenhouse? And actually she was saying like, I think that since the environment is changing that much, apparently the agriculture will be in buildings that are controlled, like big greenhouse. And obviously this argument comes from someone that is in Netherlands, where most of
Okay.
the production is done in a greenhouse, and they
Yeah.
are really good at it. But when we talk about these changes in the environment, the idea doesn't sound that crazy. So do you have any comments?
sorry, I zoned out.
It's okay.
Can you restate it, Betsa? Just the last.
Are we gonna produce our food in the greenhouse?
No, I don't think you can produce the food for the world in a greenhouse. Maybe some of it, but I think where we're going, and it's kind of why I got into plant breeding, you want to make a difference in the world. We do have to create crops that are better in nutritional value, do produce high yield, so that we can do it on less land with less inputs. But I don't know if I'd believe it doing it in a greenhouse or a growth room. Even with I know some of the people in the Netherlands, I think it's Plant Lab. They have some really phenomenal structures in how they can stack things and turn crops fast, but it would be interesting to see. You'd have to have
It's cost effective.
yeah, if it's cost effective, because that's the other thing that you have to think about. Yeah, Michael.
So do you see a difference in generalist versus specialist for inbreds versus hybrid crops? Because you talked about keeping a common donor and then moving different trait packages, and that could be, with corn you can do that more easily than you can with soybeans, in which case you have to make individual lines to sell. So do you think corn would be more specialist and then something like a soybean or wheat would be more generalist, or do they both tend to be generalist?
So you're asking if inbreds would be more of a generalist and corn be more of a specialist. From a crossing standpoint, yeah, I agree with you, corn's easier. Soybeans, I think, and maybe some of the other crops, and I can speak more towards soybeans, I think as long as you have key people that can make the crosses and are successful at it, it could be either or. And I think it's easy with a soybean. Once you have your cross and you have the traits you want, you just have to self it. You just have to keep tracking those traits. Yeah, you're done. So one cross, you could be done. And then corn, there's a lot of inputs. You have to keep creating your inbred lines or keep maintaining those. I don't see where one could be either or. I think you'd I don't know, kind of learning it. I would almost say soybeans would be more of a specialist, but I think you could do it, any crop could be either or. I'm going to leave it at that. Z had a question, sorry. And then,
From one breeder's perspective, how fast can you actually move a specialist into a generalist, and can you ever turn a generalist into a specialist?
that's a very good question. So the question was, can you turn a specialist to a generalist and vice versa, generalist to specialist?
If you're on that frontier, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, you see that's
but
a thin line between the two.
yeah,
So if you're close to that line,
when you
it's
think
easy.
about biological evolution, you always have a big tree of organisms. However, you only see a few branches coming out. When you see the whole tree, you would call every single one of them specialists. But if you see the one come out, you call that a generalist. But that's actually not a generalist. That is just a specialist that you see coming out. So from that perspective, I would actually argue that there is no such thing as a generalist. Actually, everything is a specialist. It's just that specialist is more specialized at that family or environment.
yeah.
It's a specialist for general environment.
General special.
It truly comes back to how you define specialist or a generalist.
So from that perspective, in terms of plant breeding, since we cannot rely on millions of years to see the mutations to happen, we can only work within the variation of
Well,
right?
Well, and that's exactly right. So this obviously does mutations. I'm not looking at, like when I do my future studies, I'm not going to use mutation. I'm going to use recombination rates because I'd never get done.
Yeah.
I might finish like after everyone's gone.
For me, it'd just be more interesting to see within the germplasm how you will classify some genes as
Yeah.
specialist genes and others as more generalist.
It definitely is going to take that definition of which one is which and how we classify it. Correct. Race.
I was curious if you take any data, for example, soybean, and then you could define environments by latitude, and you can look at the number of previous cultivars and see if it's the same model, if you can see if soybeans are diversifying into specialists, or if they're still in the generalist stage. Do you have any interest in collecting observed data? Because you said with observed crops, you can use generation times higher, so maybe within a short period of 50 years, you can just look at the number of cultivars by years and the environments and see if it fits your model of it, like going from a generalist into specializing by latitude, but maybe generalizing within latitudes. So one cultivar draw across latitude, but it's specializing by latitude, since what we've expanded from the Midwest up into Canada and even the tropics, not Pacific. So that's a lot of work.
Well, then I'll just call you up and you